Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. This week what we're looking at is using information effectively, or it could have been renamed finding information effectively. The three primary things we're going to be looking at today, or at least you're going to be listening to, developing strategies for the effective use of information sources, in other words trying to find information efficiently when you've been given a task. The second is looking at primary and secondary sources and what the differences are between the two. And the last is an extremely brief look at reading skills. My hope is that by now, into week 4, you've actually had a good look around the UTAS library system, been able to find some sources or resources, and even begun to read, or just out of interest, find material that you actually want to pursue. The key point being that you actually have a working knowledge of the UTAS library system. Part of the issue as you begin to navigate the UTAS library system is the actual volume or dearth of material that is actually available, which can in some cases cause confusion, or worse, overload. So how do we ascertain whether an information source is relevant or in fact reliable? Now in terms of the latter, we're going to be dealing with that in the weeks to come. I've actually dedicated 1 or 2 lectures to that and how we actually verify sources in terms of their use and their reliability, but we'll get to that when we come to it. Anyway, back to relevance. There are 2 components to what I would term to be an effective use of a resource. The first is being able to make an initial assessment and making it quickly, and the second is to actually become a smart reader, and I'll explain those 2 terms as following. Say you're given a task, and you've got many tasks if you're one of our students, and you've been asked to actually look up a particular subject or a topic within a subject. Where do you begin your search, and how do you actually ascertain quickly what material you can use in relation to actually completing or resolving that particular task? You could do a search through the UTAS library system, which would return a lot of results. Equally, you could do a search on the internet, which would return even more results. Now there's pros to cons to these, and I'll let you look on slide 9 and 10 of the PowerPoint to actually understand what those pros and cons are for each. In both cases we'll have a huge volume of information or potential information that we could use for the task. However, what we need to do, as it indicates on slide 12 of the PowerPoint presentation, is we need to develop an ability to evaluate material quickly and effectively to see if it suits our needs, i.e. if it can actually help us complete a task. And 2, we could be familiar with a number of features of a resource which can increase our assessment speed. And as far as I'm concerned, both of those are crucial, because what I discovered very quickly in university was that you can spend a lot of time bogged down in material and not actually get anywhere, certainly not find the light you need to actually complete a task. And for me personally, some of the reading was probably some of the most important stuff that I did in my life, even though it was tangential and non-informative in terms of a task. But for you guys, in terms of efficiency and in terms of doing a task correctly, it's worth actually noting that with these particular skills you can actually achieve tasks in half the time you perhaps may have in the past, and certainly that was my case. I had to learn very quickly at times that I needed to be a lot quicker with how I actually got through material to complete tasks. One of the major obstacles I had to actually completing these kind of tasks efficiently was the fact that I had this rather odd belief that I had to read everything that I picked up. So if I picked up a book and began it, I had to finish it. This is not the case. In fact, I found it quite contrary, that you could read a chapter, perhaps even a few pages in a book, and that was okay. You didn't need to understand the entire book, but what you did need to understand is some aspect in a chapter, in a book, that actually helped you achieve a task, or at least the completion of a task. With extremely little reading, in fact, you can actually ascertain very quickly whether a resource or a source is actually appropriate for your use. In the case of books, you have, for instance, a table of contents, you have an index, you have chapter headings and chapter introductions and summaries. For me, personally, chapter headings and chapter introductions are perhaps a real key to getting into a book or a resource quickly and finding out whether you can use it or not. The author or an editor has gone to the trouble to summarise that chapter, so you have a key immediately into, or a focus, into what that chapter is about. If we turn our attention to websites, for instance, They too have a range of mechanisms from which you can ascertain whether a source is actually worth using. For instance, they have a menu or a contents page. They have specific tabs to different topics. They usually have internal searches or an intranet for some places, some things. They have sitemaps, and they often have references, but not all. Perhaps the quickest of these is using an internal search feature, which means you could actually put a search string in and see whether the actual site has many links or actual material on it that relates to the subject you're looking up. In the case of journals, from which you'll become more familiar with over time, there is abstracts, and there's also introductions and conclusions, and there's a reference list. Now for me, probably the abstract is the most important part of a journal in terms of an efficient way of finding out whether you can use it or not. An abstract is basically a summary, a complete summary of a study. So that involves the way a researcher, I guess the questions that a researcher asked, how they actually went about their research, what the findings were of that particular research, and also what the recommendations are. Now throughout that abstract, and it's usually between sort of 100 and 200 words long, is literally the keys to whether you're actually able to use parts of that study for your own work. Using these tools in all three examples that I've just given allow you, as the reader, to very quickly ascertain whether the sources that you're looking at are actually usable in terms of your work. Just as important as using these tools is also trying to develop reading skills or styles that actually make you get through material a lot quicker than you would normally. And by this I mean skimming, so where you're actually reading very quickly through a resource to search for key terms and phrases, but also when you're just simply scanning, so you're looking for whole phrases perhaps, or key words that are actually relevant to a particular task. So one may be just for information, so skimming in that sense, whereas scanning, you're actually looking directly for the material that's going to help you in your task. I want to move on to the difference between primary and secondary sources. A primary source is literally the original object, article, commentary, whatever. It's usually first-hand information. In terms of history, etc., usually it's a person who was there, was part of that particular event and wrote directly or recorded directly about a particular thing. In some respects, it's the doing thing. In the case of secondary, or a secondary source, it's usually a critique or a criticism or a commentary of some sort written about the primary source. So if you need to try and remember the difference between the two, primary is what happened, secondary is what someone said about what happened. To give you an example of a primary and secondary source, if I were to write a journal article today about my experience in UTAS, that would be a primary source because I've written it directly and I've experienced it. The secondary source would be someone in the future making some sort of commentary about what I've said. Or to use another example, if a politician were to deliver a speech, all of those political correspondents or journalists who make commentaries are delivering secondary information about that particular primary source. Another term that's occasionally used is tertiary sources. Now, a tertiary source ultimately is a step further removed from a primary material beyond secondary material. However, rather than attempting to explain it, I've actually put a table on slide number 26 which explains in part that further removal from a secondary source. Without wanting to labour any of the points that I've made so far in this rather condensed and brief lecture, or commentary perhaps is better, to me one of the most useful things about information management is actually being able to get things efficiently and quickly, which saves your time, saves you getting bored looking through material that actually doesn't interest you or doesn't help you in a task. With practice these things will come naturally, and you should, over time, hopefully, be fairly ruthless in your data collection, or at least your research. Anyway, I've gone on long enough. If you could do the worksheet in week 4, that would be great. It gives you a further insight into using material, or at least how you might use it. I hope you have a really good study week. Anyway, all the best, Mike.